Okay, thank you for that. So, Jigiv Galer, agus Fulcher is Misha Lukos McInerney, Director on Finch and Heron. I wish to welcome everyone here today to the Clans of Ireland's Cultural Summit. I am Luke McInerney, a Director of the Clans of Ireland. We have an excellent agenda ahead of us this afternoon, which is focused, rightly so, on the built heritage of Gaelic Ireland. We also have an excellent lineup of guest speakers, and I'd like to extend our deepest thanks and appreciation for them for agreeing to speak to us here today. It gives us, at the Clans of Ireland, great pleasure to be able to bring to our members, both in Ireland and abroad, those who are watching abroad, really good, high-quality speakers speaking about topics of interest for us. So our first speaker today is Dr. Rachel Moss, who is an art and architectural historian at Trinity College here in Dublin. Dr. Moss has a particular interest in medieval Ireland, which makes her, of course, an ideal person to speak to us today. Dr. Moss's research initially began in the realm of Romanesque architecture and sculpture and has broadened out to focus on such things as a social context of medieval art and architecture of the later medieval period. She has a wealth of experience, not just on medieval buildings and architecture, but also on the management of those sites as well. Dr. Moss also has experience on insular art, as well as early medieval art in the wider European context, which has seen her focus on diverse subjects such as late medieval Irish window tracery, religious symbolism in Irish art, the conservation of Irish high crosses, and the artistic aspects of reliquary shrines. She's also undertaken research and writing on illuminated manuscripts of Irish provenance, such as the Stowe Missal, and also the Book of Durrow. So, without any further ado, I invite Dr. Moss to the lectern. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Luke, for that very kind introduction, and also to the Clans of Ireland for inviting me to speak to you this afternoon. It's a rare occasion where the sun actually interferes with the quality of the picture, but I'm not going to apologise for it. It's great to see it. So what I wanted to speak about this afternoon was, I suppose, to introduce some of you will be very familiar with many of the sites that we're going to look at, but to introduce you to the later medieval architecture of Ireland, which for many years was somewhat ignored. And this goes right back to when scholars first started to study many of the tower house castles, abbeys and friaries that still dot the Irish landscape and are in fact really part, I suppose, of what we recognise to be Irish about the landscape. Part of the reason that these buildings were for quite a long time relatively ignored is that, going right back to some of the earliest texts where antiquarians started to study these buildings, they were very much identified as being English. So just a quote here from Francis Gross, who published in the very late 18th century 2 volumes, really the first illustrated architectural histories of later medieval Ireland. And he says that what he had included were only the buildings that he understood as being English. The English were everywhere erecting beautiful churches and other religious structures, so that our ancient architecture was planned and executed by English workers. Now, before you panic, I'm just going to straight away say, obviously, this is not true. And all of the clans here will probably be familiar, let's say, with a tower house associated with your clan, or indeed a friary or a parish church that has very strong associations either with patronage or indeed burial in those places. So what I thought I'd do today is actually to look at not what the English did for us, but what the Irish did when the English came. And that's really what I want to focus on for this talk. So one of the first misunderstandings, I suppose, that arose was this idea that art and architecture changed very radically with the coming of the Anglo-Normans in the late 12th century. Now, it was changing in the 12th century, but it wasn't just because of the Anglo-Normans. It was already starting to change. So I'm delighted to hear that there is one of the O'Carroll Oriels. You, well done. You are responsible European architecture to Ireland. So congratulations. King Donogh O'Carroll of Oriel, he was the founder of the monastery at Mellifont, the very first Cistercian monastery. It was a big deal at the time because it was a type of architecture nobody here had seen before, called Mellifont, or the Font of Honey, which I think is a wonderful evocative name, in a beautiful valley. The locals just called it An Monasteir Mór because it was so different, so the big monastery. They were used to seeing things like Glendalough, Clonmacnoise, the smaller church buildings. So it's really the Irish who introduce this new style of architecture, and indeed the new religious orders coming into Ireland, initially the Cistercians, Augustinians, and then in the 13th century, the mendicant orders, the begging orders, so the Dominicans, the Franciscans, and the Augustinian friars. Now, obviously, there was a pious reason behind this. The idea of patronizing the church, of paying for the construction of a large building, would, one assume, make sure that you found your place in heaven. But there were other motives that lay behind these foundations. And it's very interesting that we tend to think of history through learning history through documents, but these buildings, and indeed the objects that were made to furnish them, are historical documents in their own right, because they tell us quite a lot about politics, let's say, at a particular period. So sticking with the Cistercian monasteries, first foundation by the O'Carrolls in 1142, but quite quickly then other clans began to see this order as being very beneficial in their territories as well. So for example, the Ivrian or the O'Briens, who were down in Munster, a remarkable number of foundations are due to them. So starting off with Monastanina, which is, I'm going to use my cursor, which I hope people can see also on online, down here outside of Limerick City, the first foundation, as you can see, in 1148, probably by Turlough. And then we have this almost like a circle going down to Fermoy in County Cork, across to Kilcooley, now in Tipperary, Holy Cross, and in Insular down on the river, just upriver from Clonmel, and then finally Cork and Row. Now, why find so many? These are relatively expensive houses to found because they have to have at least 12 members and an abbot, so it needs to be fairly sizable. And they are an order that withdraw from the haunts of men. So they were an agricultural order, if you like. They worked the land, so they did the Opus Dei. So one of the benefits of patronizing that particular order was that they were able to manage large estates, especially where, for example, you didn't have multiple allies around your territories. The monks would sort of do it for you. They would farm the land, and they were very innovative in their farming. Another thing that they became particularly useful for, and especially when the Anglo-Normans begin to come in to Ireland and they begin to found their own Cistercian monasteries, they are very useful for marking out territory and protecting territory. So this is why we almost have this ring. There's piety, but it's also land management, and it's also a way of literally staking your claim in the ground and saying, look, there's a whopping great stone building here, which is being protected by the community of monks within who are loyal to me. So they were typically often built on the borders of territories. And this isn't anything new. The earlier so-called Celtic church, there was a similar motivation often behind the siting of the earlier churches. Now, what's interesting is that they did adopt this sort of European style of architecture. And I'm just showing you here the very beautiful Abbey of Cork and Row. Burren, on the edge of the Burren. Again, a very evocative name, St. Mary Petra Fertilis, or St. Mary of the fertile soil. And we all know that the Burren is famous for its botanical wonders, or sorry, the fertile rock, but it seems to be barren when you look at it from afar. And what we're seeing here is one of the last of the O'Brien foundations. So, you know, one of the most northerly. And although they followed the European style, so a big long church with a cloister, very utilitarian architecture, so that you had the sleeping, the eating, and stores and kitchens attached to the church, because all they were doing every day was the same routine. So it was a very sensible utilitarian architecture. But where the Irish diverged was in their love of sculpture and ornamentation. Unfortunately, most of these buildings have lost their roofs at some point, so other more ephemeral decoration, such as wall paintings, textiles, timber carving, which we imagine there would have been plenty of, have disappeared. But the Irish, these early Norman, if you want to call it for want of a better term, the 13th century buildings, they really celebrate sculpture. And at Corkham Row, if any of you are down visiting the Burren, do go in, and it's free, you can just wander in, and have a look. Close to the altar, there are these capitals, so the base of an arch, that are carved with different flowers. Now, you might say, so what, you see those everywhere, but actually you don't. At this time, in Paris, they're just beginning to study botany seriously as an academic subject and to actually draw, if you like, academically correct, looking at stamens and all the petals and different parts of the flowers. So at Corkham Row, the sculptors are incredibly precocious. And what they've done is they have actually carved plants which we assume were being grown around the monastery. And this has been studied by Charles Nelson of the Botany Department in Trinity, who's fairly happy with his identifications of the lily of the valley at the top, lily of the valley associated with the Virgin Mary, who is the patron, the Cistercian order, really. Most of the churches are dedicated to her. But not native to Ireland, so probably brought in to be grown in the garden. And again, it was particularly associated with the celebration of Pentecost or Whitsun, so because that's when it's flowering and the beautiful perfume. Foxgloves are all very familiar with. They seem to have been here by that time, although we're not sure if they're actually indigenous to Ireland. But some of you may be familiar with the Latin term digitalis, which is used, I think, for heart conditions now. So it basically has medicinal properties. It's also very poisonous if you sit down and munch on a bunch of it. And then underneath that, deadly nightshade, and the little, to the right of the image, the little seed pod, opium poppy. And again, I don't think I need to explain what opium poppy is used for, but it was one of the few anaesthetics available at the time. So basically what we're seeing here is a bit of history of medicine in Ireland, courtesy of the O'Briens. What was growing in the Physic garden, because a lot of these monasteries functioned as hospitals as well, places of pilgrimage. Further north, we also see another Gaelic clan as the Anglo-Normans are encroaching on Connacht. We see the O'Connors building, commissioning new monasteries as well. And again, substantial size, very beautifully built. So what we have is the foundation. The earliest of the foundations is Cistercian as well, founded by Cathal Crovdorg O'Connor, then Ballintubber, also founded by Cathal Crovdorg, and then Cong Abbey in Mayo, either by Cathal Crovdorg or probably more likely his half-brother Rory, because his family are all buried there. And again, you have beautiful sculpture at all of these monasteries, but they are built very much as a reaction to the Anglo-Normans pushing in. And what's particularly interesting at Abbey Knockmoy is the sculpture I'm showing you here, assumed to be the patron, Cathal Crovdorg, wearing a crown. Now again, the crown was not part of the Gaelic regalia. A Gaelic clan chief did not wear a crown. That was European in style. But what we begin to see happening in the 13th century is not necessarily a mimicry, but we begin to see some of the iconography of kingship, of European kingship, sneaking into the Irish visual vocabulary, if you like. So, for example, at Corkham Row, there's an O'Brien tomb from the late 13th century, where the figure is wearing a crown, and you can just see to the left of him, he's got a scepter. So it's actually a bit like the top of that cross, but it hasn't got the quillions of the sword. It hasn't got the quillions of the sword, and he's grasping his cloak. Similarly, then Phelim O'Connor in Roscommon Priory, again grasping his cloak, may have had a crown, but as you can see, the head has been defaced. Also, just look at the O'Connor seal. This is the seal of Phelim, and he's on horseback, bearing a sword. That is a standard, actually, English regal iconography. Wasn't known in Ireland before this. And the legend around the seal reads Phelim Rex, or King of Connacht. He's actually calling himself Rex. So basically, they're identifying themselves as on a par with the European leaders, even though by this time the O'Connors had a relatively small territory. So just to show you this, these are roughly contemporary tombs in Saint-Denis in Paris, made very much posthumously. It was basically to create a necropolis of French royalty. So all of the Merovingians, Capetians, Carolingians had been buried there. But this is the typical way. You're shown with a crown and you're shown grasping your cloak. And again, another image here of King Arthur on the right-hand side, holding his sceptre with his crown. So the Irish are sort of joining in on this. If you can't beat them, join them. But it's very much a statement about how we see ourselves as your equal. So, we need to be spoken to in the same way. Now, what's interesting when we start to look at regalia, and it's wonderful to see the regalia that you have in the clans of Ireland, is this idea of, how do you bring across your status, for example, as a clan chief? And very importantly, I've touched already on territory, that when we come to the late 14th century and into the 15th century, as the Anglo-Normans gradually lose their grip over much of the country, except for the eastern part, and in particular the Pale, how do the older clans who lost their territory to the Anglo-Normans prove where their territory was? Land deeds were something that were brought in by the Anglo-Normans, and they didn't occur in Brehon law. So how do you prove that you are the clan chief and that you can lay claim to a particular territory? Well, one of the ways was through the possession of relics, perhaps of a saint associated with a particular territory. So, for example, the O'Donnells of Tyrconnell very much associated themselves with St. Columkill or St. Columba. So St. Columkill's Tir Connell, that was the land of Connell, and Columkillia was a member of that wider clan. So the O'Donnells basically claimed, if you like, collateral relations with the saint. So his territory then became their territory. And the way to prove this often was through the possession of a relic, so something that was associated directly with a saint. So for the Kavanagh family, the MacMurrough Kavanaghs, for example, the kings of Leinster, what Art MacMurrough Kavanagh did when he was particularly battling against Richard II at a very tumultuous time in southern Leinster, was he managed to procure the Book of Mulling, a manuscript that is now preserved in Trinity College, and he created a new reliquary shrine for it. And the reliquary shrine, you can literally go around the corner and see on display, together with the horn, I'll talk about in a minute, in the National Museum. But there's this huge crystal on the front. And the idea of a crystal on a reliquary is that it's a metaphorical window to see into the relic. It has to be protected. And crystals believed to have magical qualities as well. But rather than giving you a window onto the manuscript, the inscription, which you may just be able to see underneath, basically is saying, Art MacMurrough Kavanagh is King of Leinster, using the word Rex again. This was a hereditary object. It was passed down through various members of the Kavanagh clan, together with this horn, which is an elephant horn, probably going back to the 12th century, but that was recovered in the 15th. And we have a documentary evidence from the 17th century to say whichever Kavanagh owned this horn and a particular chair, he was the chief of the clan. So these objects we now tend to think of as just sort of relics of saints, but they were very politically charged as well. And you know, the patronage of art and architecture is very much tied into clan politics. Another, I think you've already been hearing a little bit about Iwinne in East Galway, another clan very interested in using art and architecture to elevate status. For example, in the commissioning of this wonderful manuscript, which is now in the Royal Irish Academy, again, just down the road in Dawson Street. And basically the idea of these manuscripts, they're typically historical miscellanies. So they include things like genealogies, very important, often forged genealogies, but very important to lay claim, if you like, to the rights that you had. But also an interest in the classics. You have stories often related to kingship, biblical stories, poems, also things like Din Shankas, or the lore of landscape, which again sometimes tied into this idea of territorial rights. But what's fascinating about them is, and there's a collection, gosh, maybe about 700 or 800 of these manuscripts still surviving from the 14th up to the 17th century, is the style. you'd be forgiven for thinking that you're looking at a slightly less accomplished Book of Kells, because they're looking back to a much earlier style in writing. And this is very deliberate. It's like, in a way, I say to the students, when you get your degree, it's written in Gothic script because age gives it sanction. You know, if you go to a 400-year-old university, that says something that we're still here. It's the same idea. These were almost, they weren't deliberate forgeries, but it was to give it, you know, authority and sanction. And I'm just showing you a comparison, the Book of Iwerne, late 14th century, compared to a 12th century book. You can barely tell the difference. So these are being written in an antiquated but very national style. This is immediately what we say, oh, that looks Irish or that looks Gaelic. It was happening in Scotland, Gaelic Scotland at the same time as well. So this particular manuscript was commissioned by one of the O'Kellys, who at the time was Archbishop of Tuam. And it said that, and again, I stand to be correct because I know there's an expert in the audience, it was said that really by the 15th and into the 16th century, the O'Kellys had as many as 80 tower houses scattered around their territory. But again, going back to this idea of church building and church patronage, Abbey Knockmoy was already on the boundary of part of their territory. So rather than going and demolishing it because it was an O'Connor foundation, what do they do? Well, one of the key ways to display, if you like, your patronage of a monastery or an abbey or a friary was to have a very prominent founder's tomb. So what the O'Kelly do in the form of Melshochlan O'Kelly is he commissions a new tomb in Abbey Knockmoy. I'm guessing he decommissions an O'Connor one that would have been there already. But the style of it is really peculiar. Unfortunately, it was disassembled in 1853 and brought to Dublin to be displayed at the Great Exhibition. And when it was brought back, bits of it were purloined for a local country house. So there were bits of it in a walled garden close by to Abbey Knockmoy. But we know it was made for Melshochlan and his wife, Finola, who was an O'Connor, because there was an inscription on it. A very rare example of an inscription, Os Gaeilge, on a tomb. In fact, it's the only one I know of from the 15th century. So he's making a statement of Gaelicness, but also in the decoration, you can see these funny zigzags. I've got an arrow there at the top right. That is something of the 12th century. It's a design of the 12th century known as chevron ornament. I'm showing you a little 12th century example down there in the nuns' church. Also the little beast headstock, very 12th century. So basically what the O'Kellys were trying to do was to say, sure, we've always been here. Our name is on this tomb, and look, it's really old-fashioned looking. So it's an ancestral tomb, basically. And they also commissioned wall paintings for all around it, which still sort of surviving, but not in great condition at this stage. Another very famous aspect of the O'Kellys, and I mentioned potentially up to 80 tower houses, very, I think, appropriate for today, the very famous gathering of poets that is not only recorded in the annals, but also is recorded in the Book of Iwerne in a poem dedicated to William Bui or William Blonde O'Kelly, who we're told in 1351 held a great hosting, a feast for all of the poets of Ireland and Scotland in one of his castles. And it's often been identified with this one, with Galley Castle. Now, we're very familiar with this type of architecture, if you can call it that, because only the corner still survives. But everywhere you go in Ireland, it's dotted with the remains of these tower houses. It's thought there are around 3,000 still standing, and many more that are hidden within later buildings or that have since collapsed. But what we don't get a sense of when we look at these really magisterial buildings is what they looked like originally. And that's very important because we tend to think of them as being just these grey, very plain, very military style buildings. But that's actually not the case. And I don't expect you to read, I hate when you get lots of text on a PowerPoint, but I've highlighted a few things because the poem describes in great detail how William built a new castle. He also built roads, which the poet compares to lines of text, beautiful straight roads, where he erected circular houses with woven out of wattle and then rendered, that all the poets could stay in. And depending what rank of poet you were, it depended what street of houses you were put up in. And then describes the castle, and it talks about the closest, the joining of the timber, lime-washed stone. Then talks about artistic ironwork on the shining timber, so decorative ironwork and carved oak beams. And we have lots of these carved animals on the beams, all of which is carving we have left from the medieval period is in Limerick Cathedral in St. Mary's, I think probably commissioned by Bishop O'Dea. I think I heard an so there's a shout out for you. But it brings home the fact that often these tower houses, they weren't just the tower, they were also a great banqueting hall attached. All of these have now disappeared. So we have to kind of reimagine in our heads what these would have looked like. And only very recently, in the last 20 years or so, has there been a more thorough attempt to try and document, for example, wall paintings that survive in tower houses. So this is an example from Ballyportry Castle near Corofin in County Clare of an archbishop blessing, and beside a window, and on the other side of the window is St. Sebastian, who is the patron saint guarding against plague. So we assume that's why the paintings are there. You can actually hire this castle. It's a holiday let. Too expensive for me, but it looks amazing. So you can look that up online. Also, the O'Shaughnessy Tower House near Gort at Ardmullivan, where an incredible programme of wall paintings survive in the great feasting hall at the top of the tower house. Very basically, they've been covered in algae, and one of the architects who was looking after it was waiting for somebody to arrive one day, and these eyes peered back out at him. And then conservation was subsequently done. They're scenes from the Passion of Christ, which you might think is unusual for a secular building, but the secular and the sacred were very much intertwined in the medieval period. So sticking with the O'Kellys very briefly, also founded religious buildings here, Kilconnell Franciscan Friary, and took over the patronage at Clontuscut Priory as well. So again, they have the territory that they're gaining, and also importantly, they leave their stamp by creating new tombs. And we begin to get this lovely tomb sculpture, one of the few things that survives in terms of art in these buildings. And although, for example, this tomb at Kilconnell, we don't know who's buried in it. We assume it's one of the O'Kellys because there was a succession of O'Kelly priors. Again, keeping an eye out for O'Kelly interests in the territory. But we do know something about them because they have chosen very particular saints to decorate the actual tomb itself. One of these that I'm showing you enlarged is St. James Major, and he's shown as a pilgrim. He's got his pilgrim staff, pilgrim hat, and you may just be able to work out the scallop shell, and he's got a pilgrim satchel with a scallop shell. So this is a symbol to say that whoever is interred there had been on pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. This is someone who's come back from Spain and wants to be remembered in death for his piety. Now, I've mentioned tower houses as being decorated and very beautiful. Obviously, they were also used for defence. And this is just an excuse to show some beautiful photos of the west of Ireland, but it's also very important. These are the O'Malley, some of the O'Malley tower houses dotted around Clew Bay. Clew Bay, a very important place on the west coast of Ireland because it was sheltered. So if you imagine ships coming up the western coast of Ireland in the weather that we've just recently had, you need somewhere to go in and get a bit of protection. But the O'Malley's obviously famous for Granuaile, the pirates, but they also obviously had important interests in terms of the land, inland, and using natural resources there, but also particularly in fish and trading in fish. So to protect this, you have much more austere, actually, tower houses. And when you look particularly at the size of the windows, you see, yes, these are actually much more defensive. You would think by the time you get to the upper level, where in the west of Ireland, you tend to have the hall at the top level and the chimney going right out the roof. In Leinster, it tends to be a bit lower down. But even there, they don't have big windows. So they must have been incredibly dark and chilly. So very utilitarian in this instance, but defending their rights. And again, we tend to think of tower castles in that in that way. But we should also be thinking about some of the friary buildings, the church buildings that were founded by these families as also having multiple functions. It's not just about prayer and burial. So the O'Malleys also found Murrisk Friary, just at the foot of Croagh Patrick, which is there in the background. I do know actually this was used as somewhere where pilgrims would come and stay when they were doing the pilgrimage all those years ago. But it meant that the O'Malleys probably had a hand in charging pilgrims, and nothing is for free in this life. So might have actually made some income out of that. And then across Clew Bay on the other side, Burrow Priory, which looks quite modest. It is quite a small priory. And certainly although it was a foundation of the de Burgos or the Burkes, we know that by the late 15th and into the 16th century, the O'Malleys had an interest in it. This chalice still survives. Oh, I forgot, Gráinne's name is O'Malley. So she married Thomas de Burgo. And on the foot of that chalice, made in 1497, probably in Galway, the celebrant was lifting it at Mass. What did he see but the names of the patrons? So that was not left to accident. But the reason I'm showing you these two, and in particular Burrow is to bring home this idea that it's not just about piety, and these buildings had multiple functions. So when, after the Reformation and when Connacht was being attempted to be replanted by Queen Elizabeth I, Sir Nicholas Malby, president of Connacht, described Burrow. He talks about, it's based in a little inlet on Clew Harbour. A ship of 500 tons could stay there at low tide. In the hinterland, it was full of great timber, marble, other commodities, and a great store of good ground, arable and pasture. There was an iron mine, an abundance of wood in every way. 50 English ships came to fish there. And then in green, I've highlighted, they have been before this time compelled to pay a great tribute to the O'Malleys. So what's happening here is that they're getting the Dominican friars, in this case, almost to manage their financial interests along this coast where it would have been very easy to have smugglers and so on. And we see this right around the coast of Ireland. So for example, I know there's an O'Donnell of Tyrconnell. The O'Donnells did the exact same thing at Donegal. They build their castle, they build a friary, and the friars manage the fishing out of Donegal. And then both O'Donnell castles and friaries all the way, and also then their affiliated families, the McSweeneys, for example, all around the coast to keep an eye basically on what's going on. So when we visit some of these very beautiful, ruins in the landscape, somewhere like Moyne Friary in Mayo, just outside Killala, you pull up, there isn't a car park. It's one of those wonderful unspoiled sites. You get to the gate and it says, beware of the bull. So you have to be very brave, but it's worth it. And you walk across the fields with a stick. And here is this perfectly preserved friary. If you put a roof on it, it would be fully functional. It is an incredible structure. There's nothing around it, though. There's no castle. There's no village. It's only about maybe 3 miles from Killala, which was a diocesan centre. And it was run by the live off begging for alms, of providing. So why is it there? Well, this is an aerial shot, and you'll have to take my word for it, but my red circle is Moyne. Why I'm showing you this from so far up, there's an island there, Bartra Island. I'll use my cursor there. And this is basically the Moy estuary, and then you're in the Atlantic. So this is wonderfully sheltered. You come in either through Killala Harbour or actually, if you're coming up through the Moy. And, it's very, very sheltered. And again, just honing in on it, you can still see the precinct wall that survives all of the way around it. And when we go into the friary, on the left-hand side, I hope you can make that out, scratched into the medieval plaster is an image of a ship. And then you start staring at the wall, ideally when the sun is out, because you can't see a thing when it's raining, and you begin to see more ships appearing. And for a long time, people said, oh, this must be the guidelines for a painter. Maybe they had a painting of ships it's on the west wall as you're exiting the church, basically. But that's probably not the case. What these are what's known as an ex voto. And they're very common in medieval churches, particularly around port towns. You sometimes find them in castles, actually, as well. I'm showing you here graffiti of ships at Rochester Cathedral in Kent, again, and obviously another big port town. And the idea was that merchants would come and pray, maybe once they docked, they would pray thanksgiving for having got there safely, but also when they left, they would pray at a particular altar, often dedicated to St. Nicholas, who is the patron saint of merchants, maybe St. Christopher, patron saint of travellers. But rather than, as we might do today, lighting a candle, well, they probably did that too, but they would actually scratch in an image of their ship. And this is actually quite common. So it brings home just the fact Moyne was being used by sailors, by merchants. And then we look at some Galway wills from the late 16th, early 17th century, and we find Galway merchants bequeathing money to Moyne, which was a Burke foundation. And it's clearly being used as a place of safe harbour. But also from the 17th century, we do have references to salt panning. And that suggests maybe they're also engaged in, for example, you've got a big land of fish. What are you going to do with it? You need to bring it in, you need to preserve it. So the friars are helping with that as well, presumably then passing on a payment to their Burke patrons. And then just to finish off, as was very astutely mentioned at the start of the lecture, it's also thought that the Burkes, the friars, we know that there was a school, there was a novitiate for Franciscans at Moyne, and even after the Reformation, a provincial of the Franciscans visited Moyne, and he tells us that the friars had been allowed to stay, though an English widow was now living there. Now, it's clear that there was a school there and that there would have been very accomplished scribes there. So Manuscript was commissioned by the Burke family, who had a long association, around 1570. So this is post-Reformation. And it seems to have been made at Moyne Friary. And essentially what it is, it's a genealogy dated to about 1570. But it goes back to the theme I started with, this, not quite if you can't beat them, join them, but bringing across the idea that you are on a par with royalty from elsewhere. Because what MacWilliam Burkes do is they commission this beautiful illuminated manuscript, lots on the genealogy, and then it has a series of 4 images from the Passion of Christ. I'm showing you one here, Christ carrying the cross. The reason I've got a woodblock print beside it of Albrecht Dürer is because clearly printed exemplars, and of course they're supporting art. Now, post-Reformation, remember, and images of the Passion, very Catholic in their nature. Then you have a whole of the descendants. So it's commissioned by horse, and then you have another 13 Burkes going right back to the 12th century in beautiful, bright colours. Half of the manuscript is written in Irish. And I'm showing you one of the pages here. But another part of it is written in Latin. So it's intended for 2 different audiences. As Gaelic, it's obvious enough, it's for a local audience. But the Latin one pains to go into a rather obscure and forged line of Burke ancestry that claims that they are cousins of Queen Elizabeth I. So on the one hand, they're keeping their foot very firmly in Roman Catholicism with these images of the Passion, but on the other, it's like, okay, well, we'll just cozy up to the Queen a little bit as well. So again, it's this sort of dual idea of kingship, but ultimately these clans saw themselves very much on the same level as the great rulers of Britain and indeed the continent. So I will leave it there, and Luke, look forward to having a more chat. Thank you very much.